Hello everyone and welcome to episode 1 of Region Lock, the series where we take a game, break down the changes made between their regional releases, and compare them to each other. Because of the ongoing Crash Bandicoot content I've been putting out on the channel, I thought it only makes sense for the first game for us to cover to be Crash Bandicoot, or if you're from Japan, Crash Bandicoot. Crash has had many significant changes made to his design and gameplay throughout the years, but maybe none so much compared to his first outing, especially in Japan. But before we get into the truly deep changes, I'd like to cover the differences between the US and European releases, or for the gaming savvy, the NTSC and PAL releases. The first major changes were made to the covers of the game. Although the front covers are mostly the same save for a few logo placement changes, the back show significant style variations. The US cover has a lot more going on, with a font that matches the zany and wild essence of Crash. It also features a brief rundown of the story, telling the player about Crash's goal to save his girlfriend, and also follows that up with the highlights of the game, even showing that from the very start, PlayStation has been all about exclusivity. The levels shown on the cover are the labs, the pinstripe boss fight, the Great Gate, Upstream, and Road to Nowhere, showing the variety the game has to offer, while also sporting a very faded image of Crash in the background. The European cover, however, is a lot more simplistic in its design and overall looks cleaner. Being released in Europe, the story rundown is a lot smaller on this cover, to make room for the explanation being in English, French, and Dutch, while also having a rather generic font. While the US cover went in depth about its premise, such as Torna being held captive, the European text simply tells the reader about the levels and actions they'd be doing as Crash, such as crossing flaming pits, sailing across rivers, and riding wild piggies. The levels shown are also different, with Insanity Beach, the Great Gate, Stormy Ascent, Temple Ruins, and Hog Wild being their choices instead. Unlike the US cover, the European cover also displays 3 out of the 6 bosses, Pinstripe, Ripperoo, and Cortex. Replacing the faded image of Crash from the US cover is an overhead side shot of the first island in the game that makes for some amazing artwork. Now that we've covered the physical differences, it's time to move on to the gameplay differences. The most obvious one to point out is the opening splash screen, with the US release showing Sony Computer Entertainment America, or SCEA, while the European splash screen shows Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, or SCEE. However, what isn't the most obvious is the complete absence of the anti-piracy screen. The US version segues straight into the Sony Computer Entertainment Presents message, whereas the European version displays a brief anti-piracy measure to its audience for about 5 seconds before moving on to the aforementioned message. This was due to Europe having more relaxed anti-piracy laws than the US, but still wanted to save face by warning those who may have a bootleg copy of the game. Although not exactly uncommon knowledge, it's known that PAL games from this era ran at 25 FPS, whereas the NTSC games ran at 30. The simplest way for my brain to understand this was because of electrical frequencies differing between regions, with NTSC operating on 60Hz frequencies, whereas PAL operated on 50Hz. As a result, the frames simply got cut in half of the frequencies they operated on, leaving us with 25 and 30. Today, these changes are few and far between, but back in the time of CRT TVs and composite cables, they had a huge impact on the physics systems of games, which could end up in players around the world having some pretty different experiences. One such impact of this change in Crash Bandicoot is the timings of various enemies and obstacles, such as the TNT crate. In the NTSC versions of the game, the crate takes a little longer to count down and explode, ending at about 4.3 seconds. But in the PAL version, there's a very slight difference in the speed, with the TNT crate counting down and exploding in about roughly 3.7 seconds. Although half a second isn't much difference, the 5 frames per second between copies really do add up, especially when it comes to the physics being slightly heavier and the game running a little faster in the PAL release. Another victim of the timing changes is the Ripperoo boss fight. Just like the TNT crate, Ripper's jump speed wildly differs between the 2 versions of the game. For American audiences, it takes on average about 5 seconds for Ripper to perform a full rotation of jumps from one platform to the next. However, for European players, this speed is slightly slower than its variant, averaging out at around 7.5 seconds for his first rotation. I'm a little unsure of why the crate countdown is faster in the PAL version, but Ripper is slower in the same release, but I assume it was due to difficulty curving in some aspects. However, the frame differences aren't exactly things that can hinder the player, as a lower frame rate can have some advantages. This is especially true in the level The Lost City. Because of the NTSC version running at 30 frames, the way the game works can be a little bit more strict than other versions. At the very start of the level, there are a few metal crates to the left of the player, which requires them to jump around them to get to the other side, since Crash's jump limit is 2 crates high. Meanwhile, over on the PAL copy, thanks to the 5-frame difference, the player is actually able to jump over the metal crates due to the game skipping the frames that Red Crash is getting stuck. Interestingly enough, this only applies to the first jump, and doesn't allow the player to jump back over the same way they came, which raises a lot more questions than answers. The crates aren't the only thing in the Lost City to hold some regional differences either, only this time it's something a little more noticeable. Due to technical issues, the lizards in the level were completely bugged in the final release of the US version, with their spiky spines completely absent, resulting in a slightly less evolved appearance. This bug applied to both the green and the red lizards that jump towards the player. In the PAL release of the game, the developers fixed this bug by restoring the spikes of the lizards, making them much more threatening to go up against and overall resulting in a more clean and polished look. Despite the numerous differences between the two Western releases, the extensive changes made to the game prior to its release in Japan are far more significant. But before we completely move on from the West, I'd like to leave you with one of the most cursed Crash Bandicoot commercials ever released in the East. Just like the changes made to the game cover for Western audiences, the Japanese variant has much more differences. Featuring a bold red and yellow font, the cover shows and tells various changes between the two. The front of the box drastically changes Crash's looks, with his art style appearing to be more cute. Sony's executives in Japan were worried that Crash's appearance was too edgy for their general audience, so they instructed the team to make him look more alluring towards customers. This ended up being a great idea, as after Crash's release, he became insanely popular with females in their mid-20s due to him reminding them of cute animals. The back was also drastically changed compared to the Western release. To make the game more enticing, the developers displayed the text in a bold and yellow-red font, catching the attention of those who wanted to quickly understand what it was about. There are also numerous screenshot changes made, with the most obvious one being a snippet that shows Brio and Cortex, with the text under it reading "Stop Dr. Cortex's ambitions." I should note that I don't speak nor read Japanese in any way, and some translations may not come across as correct, so if at any point I get something wrong, please correct me below in the comments. Unlike the regional covers, the Japanese cover also goes as far as showing one of the various secret paths the player can find along their playthrough, showcasing more content that is completely absent from any other box art. Because Japan also operates on the same electrical frequencies as the US, most if not all of the frame timings present in the NTSC releases are present within the Japanese release of the game, earning the title of NTSC-J, with the J being the obvious. As such, I won't be covering the frame timings and other stuff because I already have, but there are still plenty of game changes to speak about. The splash screen in the Japan version shows Sony Computer Entertainment Incorporated, or SCEI, as opposed to SCEE or SCEA. This is because Sony is a Japanese-owned company, making all the other HQs around the world extensions of the main one with their own branding. Opening up the game, the main menu is predominantly the same between versions with a few minor tweaks. The Crash Bandicoot logo was a lot easier on the eyes in this version, and pops out a lot more, keeping the same yellow and red font from the back of the box art. Unlike the Western releases where passwords were given to the player after every bonus round as a way to save their game, that option is completely removed in the Japanese version. This was because the PlayStation 1 actually came with a memory card in Japan when it was released, whereas it did not in the West. Surprisingly enough, the menu for the passwords is still accessible in this version if the player inputs up, up, down, down, left, right, left, right, left, right circle into their controller. The codes appear unchanged across all regions, as the inputs for a 100% completion save file appear to work across all 3 releases. Another noticeable change is obviously Crash's voice actor. In the Western version, Crash is voiced by Brendan O'Brien. However, in the Japanese version, his voice actor is Mitsuo Yamaguchi, better known by his stage name Kappei Yamaguchi. One thing I find absolutely hilarious is that Mitsuo is also the voice actor of L from Death Note, and as such is now the highlight of this video. A fundamental gameplay element that is completely removed from the Western release is the Aku Aku hints. When Crash finds an Aku Aku mask in any given level, he will give the player a rundown on the stage and an idea of how to beat it. This holds true from the very start of the game and carries over until the end of it. To make the stage names more understandable and reflect various Japanese expressions, they changed a lot of them in the final Japanese product due to localization and translation barriers. This is apparent for pretty much every stage, with Insanity Beach being named Awakening Beach to reflect that Crash literally wakes up on a beach, and Slippery Climb being named Kojo Arashi, loosely translating to Small Storm, which matches the level name pretty well. Adding further to the language localization changes is also the TNT crate change. In the Western release, Naughty Dog simply wrote the word TNT on the side of the crate, but for Japan and other countries with a lower rate of English speakers, they replaced the TNT text with a universal symbol of a bomb, which is something I think everyone can understand the meaning of. To further coincide with difficulty spikes and changes, there were many things swapped around and messed with to make for a more fluid experience for Japanese audiences. One of the more apparent ones is the level placement for the players. In the US release, Sunset Vista comes straight after Boulder Dash. However, to make sure that Japanese players didn't want to throw the game consoles out of the windows, Slippery Climb and Sunset Vista completely swap positions, with Sunset Vista being placed after the High Road and Slippery Climb being placed after Boulder Dash. But simply placing levels somewhere different wasn't enough to help curb the problems, so there were a lot further changes made both within and outside of stages. This sticks out the most in the levels upstream and up the creek. For players in the US release, things such as the grass platforms, the lily pads, and the leaves were extremely hard to land on since they moved rather fast and were pretty small. Naughty Dog did not ignore this complaint from players, and as a result, made significant changes in the Japanese version. They increased the size of these objects, with the platforms being 10% larger, the lily pads being 20% larger, and the leaves being 30% larger, with the purpose of making these changes to make it a little easier for players to clear their jumps. What is particularly interesting is the fact that even though the game designers redesigned the levels to be exceedingly easier for Japanese players, they actually made one stage harder for them. In the West, Papu Papu is the first boss fight we go up against in the game, which is simple and straightforward with only 3 phases of health. However, in Japan, the developers completely changed his health bar, giving the player 5 phases to fight. While this wouldn't be a significant change to face, what sets this fight apart is that Papu's attacks increase in speed with each decrease in health. This means that during the final phase of the Japanese version, you would practically need to activate your Sharingan to time the attacks. Papu Papu is not the only boss to have some changes made to his fight, although the other bosses and their differences pale in comparison to his. According to sound designer Josh Mansell, Sony executives in Japan didn't consider the soundtracks video gaming enough, so they requested the changes at the last second. As a result, the sound designer had only 1 day to rewrite the themes for Cortex, Brio, Pinstripe, and Koala Kong in the final version of the Japanese release.
Bandicoot.
While on the topic of soundtracks, the boss fights weren't the only changes to the game's music. Just like the boss music, Japanese executives also had another bone to pick with another sound in particular, which was the bonus round music. In the US version, the bonus round music had a cool guitar backing. But Japanese players considered it too nostalgic and demanded a change. As a result, they replaced it once again with something more video game-like. Another interesting thing about the bonus rounds is the fact that in the US version, Torna will simply hang around with Crash. However, for Japan, I think it's implied she's more of a hologram and will instead disappear when Crash gets closer to her. Despite Papu Papu being made harder, there were massive overhauls made to levels within the game, but perhaps no more than the level The High Road. For US players, the level was often said to be the hardest in the game behind Slippery Climb, forcing them to test everything they've learned about Crash and his movements so far, often ending in tears. However, the developers abruptly cut the level extremely short for Japanese players at the halfway point, leaving a large void where the next section should have been shown. Fortunately, the other levels were not cut short like the High Road, but they did experience alterations in their own unique ways. During the level Toxic Waste, players come across a bouncing crate that offers Wumpa Fruit to earn an extra life. However, the Japanese version of the game offers players an Aku Aku crate as a reward to assist them in the remainder of the stage. In the US version, they also make the change to the stage The Jaws of Darkness, which throws us straight into the frying pan. In the Japanese version, players receive an Aku Aku mask as soon as the level begins. This idea continues through to one of the final stages, the Labs, which, just like the Jaws of Darkness, has an Aku Aku crate right at the start for Japan, but is completely absent for the West. One of the final changes made to the difficulty is more of a quality of life change than anything, but still appreciated regardless. For the players to achieve 100% completion, they must beat every stage without dying, while also smashing every crate in the level to be awarded with a gem, and the placement of the colored gems varies between regions. For US players, the Lost City gives the green gem, and Slippery Climb gives the red gem to fight for the secret ending. To make things a little easier for Japanese players, the game developers changed these stages, with Hog Wild offering the green gem and the Lost City offering the red gem, meaning that Slippery Climb now offers a clear gem instead. For the last change I wanted to cover, it's something a little more wholesome than anything. Whenever the player missed a crate in a level, the crates Crash glossed over in the US release would typically beat him, which would make any parent want to call the ASPCA. Because executives thought having a cute animal beaten is cruel, they changed this in the Japanese version, with only a single crate falling onto Crash regardless of how many he missed. And that is just about every change between every version of Crash Bandicoot for the PlayStation 1. I just want to say thank you to everyone who watched through to the end. This was my first attempt at creating a new format that wasn't the retrospectives, so I hope you really enjoyed it. If you'd love to see more, let me know in the comments below on what games you'd like to see me cover, and I'll most likely add them to the list. If you also enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. It would mean the world, and it also helps keep the dream alive. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.